talking about a book called AntiFragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It's a great book. It's had a lot of impact on my own life, on how I think about business, just my philosophy on life, business, family. You wouldn't think that a book could have that much impact, but great books do. And in light of recent events, with what's going on with coronavirus right now, and the stock market being as crazy as it is, I thought this was a good time to take a look at some of Nassim Taleb's work. And Nassim Taleb, as some of you probably already know, is the famous author behind Black Swan. He kind of predicted the stock market crashes that's happened in the past. He's a pretty amazing guy, and he's pretty opinionated. So he thinks what he thinks, and he lets you know it, and which makes his books a very interesting read. Certainly challenging. Um, so first, I'm going to start out with what the basic concepts are. The basic concepts are, you have systems and things that are fragile in life. You have tough things. Then you have anti-fragile things, right? Or systems that are anti-fragile. Fragile. Today I was gonna use glass or something similar as fragile, but my camera setup over here is very fragile. And this was a it was a funny kind of like universe talking to me, kind of fragile because as I was setting up my uh, iPhone on my DJI Osmo, which has to be very carefully, precisely balanced. Um, I was setting it all up, and I hadn't thought through some things. And what do you know? This gust of wind comes in and knocks the thing over. And that glass back on the camera is definitely fragile. Thankfully, it didn't break, but it's funny enough to me at least that talking about anti-fragility, we're using a very fragile setup to do so. So again, in life, there are things that are fragile, and a good way to kind of think about that is it's what happens when you become soft or when you become vulnerable. Sometimes, if cuddle yourself too much, protect yourself too much, right? Aren't ever exposed to any viruses or any other calamities in life. The very first one that hits you can just knock you off your game. That can kill you, right? Yeah, few hundred years ago, when Westerners first went into Africa, they started dying off very, very fast because there were viruses, malaria, and diseases there that their bodies simply weren't used to. Whereas the locals, they're pretty used to it. Growing up or being born in Bangladesh, I'm sure I've had to fight more diseases than your average kid in the United States. Although now with the world being more connected, maybe that's making us, more anti-fragile as opposed to fragile. So with the coronavirus going on, that's a pretty interesting thing to think about. Now you have your fragile systems, then you have your tough systems. Like steel is tough, right? A lot of companies like to name themselves things that are tough, that are just always tough, right? Like BlackRock. No offense to any of these companies, or BlackRock or Sequoia, things that project strength. Um, but those are just tough systems, and sometimes you're born tough, sometimes you're not, right? So you can build a tough system, you can try to build yourself to be really tough, but tough has its own fragility too. Nassim Taleb introduces this concept of anti-fragile, where the system actually gains whenever it gets pushed, whenever it gets tested. So things like our immune system, when it gets tested and it gets pushed, or like your muscles, which I've been slowly trying to work on, but are like our minds actually. When you push it to the limit and you don't break it, you actually end up making it tougher. So your muscles, you work out and you're basically assaulting your muscles, and then your muscles get tougher. Um, and that's actually pretty core to human beings, to humanity. Um, we get better with time. We get better with tests. We get better through hardships. And right now, we're suffering through some hardships. We're getting thrown some curveballs. And this is exactly where we should shine. The first time I read this book, the I remembered like it really just challenged me to the core because before then I'd just gotten into entrepreneurship and I was trying to read as many books as possible to learn about how to build a business. And I was just going, oh, there's a model to doing this. And you basically just follow the formula, you copy, paste, and you'll be successful. Until I really started thinking. I started thinking, well, if these big businesses are so successful, if these big banks are so successful, they seem awfully fragile. I've worked at some big companies myself, and I'm sure some fellow engineers have felt this way as well. They work in these organizations that are big, that are like big ships, but you can almost sense the fragility in the system and that it's not able to deal with these black swan events. Um, just for those of you who haven't read Black Swan, um, Black Swan is like coronavirus. Nobody's been preparing for it, right? And suddenly one day there it is, right? And those who are not prepared, those who are less paranoid, they can, those who don't really think through the implications of black swan events usually get wiped out by them. Nassim Taleb uses some language to dramatic effect, saying, if you're a chicken or you're a farm animal, you're getting fed every day of your life, and you're like, oh, the food just comes in every morning at this time. Life is good. This dude right here gives me food. The black swan event is the day that you get slaughtered, right? You're getting prepared for slaughter. And when that day comes, you are not prepared for it. It's a very terrible and dramatic way of describing it, but I think it gets to the point of it. Is That's what fragility does. Like you don't test these systems that are built to kind of be anti-fragile. Nature, by nature, is actually anti-fragile. If whatever calamities happen, some trees, some animals, they adapt, they get stronger, they get better, they thrive. So ever since the beginning of my business career, I've been thinking and reflecting on this book and as to how do you build an anti-fragile business. Well, I don't know if you really can build a really ginormous anti-fragile business. If anyone has one, it's probably Apple. And part of the reason I feel they have a more anti-fragile business is they, routinely just inject disruption. They they don't just say, okay, we're just going to stick with the max and never innovate. They innovate. They cannibalize their own products, but they continue to dominate the market. Um, for startups, I think you can't not be anti-fragile. For entrepreneurs, that's not really an option, especially when the stock market does what it's doing right now. The VCs are all shut down, right? They're doubling down on the safest bets possible, right? That's when you really need to be anti-fragile. And I personally believe that the best way to build an anti-fragile business is to have an anti-fragile culture, a culture that values learning, a culture that does value moving fast. I know it sounds like Facebook, move fast and break things, but you have to have people who are resilient, who are agile, who aren't stuck to just one way of doing things, because your business, after all, is just a you know cumulative emergent phenomena of a bunch of people working on it, especially if it's you know service oriented SaaS or knowledge work related business. If it's not a factory, for example, um, factories actually are fragile. I have business interests in factories, and I know they can be fragile because if the machine breaks, if there's an earthquake, you're down. The machine is single point of failure. So can you make a factory anti-fragile through culture? Maybe a little bit, right? Uh, but yeah, definitely a business that relies on people, software businesses, service businesses, marketing firms, much of what the US economy is based on. It can be anti-fragile. I've actually taken the concept of anti-fragility into my family life and my personal life as well. Um, I know, like seeing my body, you probably go, it doesn't look like you've been working out those muscles too much, Ahmed. And you'd be right. But in my mind, I figured, let me try to do the same thing to my mind. Let me read more, learn more, reflect more personally, and do those things like athletes do. Athletes train, right? So in my craft, how can I train? How can I keep myself fit? How can I keep my brain fit, right? My mind fit? And same for my family. One of the things I noticed after a couple of years in business, life was good. Things were good, and I noticed in my kids um, that they were starting to maybe become fragile. They were asking me questions like, my friends have butlers. They don't have to have, you know, they don't have to do chores. Why do we have to do chores? Um, and I started to get scared. Prior to that, I just copy pasted thoughts from most other people. I thought, hey, if I leave my kids a lot of money, they'll be fine, and that's not true. That's not true at all. I think the best thing that I can leave my family and my kids with is the ability to be anti-fragile, the ability to adapt, to be agile, and just roll with the punches. You never know what's going to happen. You don't know what that black swan event is going to be, but rest assured, there will be black swan events. Coronavirus, who knew, right? We don't know what the next thing is going to be, but there are so many moving pieces. The only thing that's for sure is something is going to happen. It's always happened. You can look in the past and you can kind of extrapolate to the future. Empires have fallen because they became fragile. So, what's a good way to make yourself anti fragile? It's like getting a virus, or it's like, you know, getting your flu shot. So, what your flu shot does is it injects a little bit of viral material into your veins. But it trains your immune system on how to kill it, how to destroy it, and it actually makes you stronger. Initially, when you get the flu shot, you might get a fever, but the benefit of it on the other side is when one of those strains of viruses hits you, it won't kill you. So, being anti-fragile from an immune system perspective is um, pretty central to what an immune system does. So, apart from business, just in like normal life, I've thought a lot about, how can I use this concept of anti-fragility in parts of your life where you have the most fragility. And of course, I have quite a ways to go. One of the big places where I have to make improvements is my personal health. So even though I don't have to come up to the mountaintop to do these videos, I try to make it a point to come up. I love coming up here, looking at the views, and you have the occasional folks looking at me weird, like, what is this guy doing talking to his phone? Um, hey, hopefully it helps my anti-fragile physical body as well. So the other thing that I wanted to bring up is I never really appreciated philosophy before this book. And again, this is just my own personal journey. But philosophy can have a significant impact on the real world, even though I initially looked at it as something very theoretical. Like, yeah, philosophers, they just sit around and talk about stuff. But reading Nassim Taleb's book, it was kind of jarring and eye opening at the same time because the philosophy part of it made me question what are my core beliefs? How do I really think? Because I accepted a lot of things as they are, or as they were. For example, one of the things that he brings up is Western education a product of Western success? Or is Western success a product of the education? Most of the world tends to think that you go to Harvard, you go to MIT, or you have Western style education. That's what gives the Western world all of these successes, all of these material successes. But he questions that very premise and he says, is that really true? And of course, no surprise, here's a guy in Silicon Valley saying, higher education isn't all that it's trumped up to be. But it's important to actually think about that the fact that MIT only admits the very best, Harvard only admits the very best. So there's kind of that selection of people. And then you don't see millions of Harvard graduates all being equally successful. There are a few that are super successful, others who aren't. And if you actually look at very successful CEOs or whatever your criteria for material success is, you'll notice that there are people from other walks of life who are generalists, who are, Steve Jobs famously was not, you know, Harvard grad or an MIT grad. He was just wandering around in India trying to figure life out. And it would be wrong to say, oh, he didn't follow the formula, you know, um, therefore he should not be successful. But those are the things that we think about that we take for granted. And there's inherent fragility when you think about systems like that, when you create systems where people don't think outside the box that much. And that's probably one of the more anti-fragile, the better secrets of Western society is that the rebellious spirit, thinking outside the box, something that's not necessarily encouraged all around the world, has been key to success. One of the reasons there's a lot more innovation here, at least in my opinion. And I know that's now not the case all around the world, but I think those are some recent changes. Now, Nassim Taleb's best part is when you read his books, like I said, it shakes you. You don't expect, the kind of language or the kind of delivery coming from a scholar. He's a very unlikely self-help guru. As a matter of fact, he's not a self-help guru. He's a mathematician and also apparently a martial artist, and has this breadth of experience. And he talked about this concept of "fuck you money," which is like having enough money to do whatever the hell you want, which also was a novel concept in my head because growing up, I always thought, okay, you go to college, you get a great job, maybe you go into business or maybe you do something else, and then boom, billionaire. That's success. Um, Nassim Taleb's book helped me challenge the concept of success and freedom. Looks like I'm gonna have to finish this video sooner than I thought because the whole concept of fragility came right back and my equipment fell over. The wind picked up like crazy, and the camera and the rest of the equipment, as I was mentioning, is not as anti-fragile. As a matter of fact, it's very fragile. So it fell over when the wind gust really picked up. So I hope I got most of the concepts in there. There's more I wish that I could get, but I didn't. Uh, Mainly, as you read more about it, I think you'll realize how influential of a book AntiFragile is and how great of an author Nassim Taleb really is. I love following him on Twitter. Um, if you get a chance, he's hilarious and interesting and very insightful. So during these tough financial times and uncertain times, uh, it's good to keep anti-fragility in mind. Thanks.